me as a child, sex was something you never talked about.
Yeah.
And I never saw any affection at home. It was never demonstrated. It was never reciprocated toward me, my parents. And so I was driven into some isolation.
I've often said that the higher you go in leadership within Christianity, the harder it is to get real with anybody about the issues that you're struggling with, particularly of a sexual nature.
And so everything became secret to me, and it drove me into a lifestyle of really two separate lives. One was finding women, then my church life as a senior pastor for 31 years. And this went on for decades.
I think that's where a lot of pastors, Christian men and women in general, I mean, others that aren't believers too, but certainly within Christendom.
We started this ministry about 8 years ago. As God just made it clear to us, let your problem become your platform. What you've been through is not that unusual.
When I was overseeing the counseling ministry at the church that I worked at, I would hear quite often, that's the thing. But if I give that up, who will I be?
For most of my life, I was more comfortable with the problem that I knew than the solution that I didn't know.
Yes. We don't have answers to who we're going to be. Really what Jesus is saying is, will you step out by faith enough and surrender enough to step into the unknown with me, where you don't know who you're going to be?
If my recovery is about me, I've missed God. The 12 steps, when they were first written in 1939, were intended to be completed in 30 days. The reason for that is that step 12 says you need to help others. If I'm not giving away my recovery, I don't have recovery.
Everybody, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Whether you're coming to us directly through Love and Truth Network or through a connection to Transforming Congregations, we're really glad that you're here, that you're joining us, and that you're going to be able to participate in this particular episode. I'm thrilled to have my friend Mark Denison here today. And Mark and I have known each other for a few years now. I'm not even sure how we originally got connected. Mark, maybe you can fill that in later on, but really happy that you're here. Just the wealth of information you have, the years that you ministered as a pastor, and also I'm really grateful for your vulnerability of sharing sexual brokenness, sexual addiction, sexual struggles, even as somebody who is pastoring a church. And we talk about this all the time. Pastors are not immune to this issue at all by any stretch of the imagination. And your willingness to put that out there and really share what was going on in your life at the time, what was going on in your family at the time of pastoring, really, I think, helps people understand that this is a much bigger issue than just a tiny portion of the male population. This is something that is much bigger than that. And it's also something that many women are struggling with, their own sexual addiction and those kinds of things. But I'm just grateful that you're here and willing to share your story and even maybe fill in some of Beth's, your wife's perspective along the way a little bit too. But anyway, audience, really glad that you're here and taking this opportunity to listen and hear from Mark. And so, Mark, I'd love it for you if you'd be willing to just kind of dive into your story a little bit and just share with our audience a little bit of well, not a little bit, a lot of God's grace in your life.
Gary, thank you. It's great to see you again. Appreciate the opportunity. I believe we first met at a SILS conference early on, probably 7 years ago, give or take. You're one of the big time guys there, and I was just kind of wandering around, brand new to all this world. And you were so kind to give us time to visit and tell us your story and how you launched your ministry. And you've been such an influence on us, and we're always grateful for that. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I appreciate what you said about pastors. My research and experience tells me that pastors are among 4 vocations that really struggle with this a lot, at least that I'm aware of. And we know statistically that about 37% of senior pastors are looking at pornography once a week. And so it's a massive issue there that we could certainly talk about. My background, how I found myself in this part of the world of recovery, is that I kind of came by it honestly. A lot of the seeds of addiction were planted early on without my knowledge. My grandfather visited a town prostitute every week, and so that sowed seeds of shame tied to sexuality in the family. I never met him. He died 12 years before I was born. But because of his lifestyle, my mother had sex and shame tied up together, and she passed that on to me. And so for me as a child, sex was something you never talked about.
Yeah.
And I never saw any affection at home. It was never demonstrated. It was never reciprocated toward me from my parents. And so I was driven into some isolation, had some physical challenges, speech impediment till I was 15. I was legally blind as a child, required multiple eye surgeries. My legs did not develop properly, so I had some issues there with some very painful braces. And so as a teenager, I was just playing catch up in so many ways between all of these challenges. And so that drove me further into isolation. And so I couldn't relate to the opposite sex. I was scared to death of them. And no one was there to help me. I came to faith in Christ at the age of 14. And the church's answer to me was just go read a book somewhere. So that didn't help. And so everything became secret to me, and it drove me into a lifestyle of really two separate lives. One was finding women that I felt safe with, which was for the most part that meant prostitutes. And then my church life as a senior pastor for 31 years was strong, it was good. Our marriage was strong, other than this huge gap that was there. And this went on for decades. And it was not until I was in my early 50s that I got help. When my wife saw something on my phone that I had no answer for. And so I finally got into a 12-step group, got into therapy, did a disclosure, a polygraph, did all of that. But was still discovered later. My disclosure was found by someone on my church computer. They exposed that, so I resigned from the church 10 years ago. After 31 years as a senior pastor, I've been an MBA chaplain and chairman of my university's board of trustees, and all of a sudden everything was gone. So we moved from Texas, where I lived my entire life, to Florida to be near our son. And we started this ministry about 8 years ago. As God just made it clear to us, let your problem become your platform. What you've been through is not that unusual. You need to be one of those guys that's willing to tell your story, help other guys. And as God put that on our plates and on our hearts, we got some training in this area, and we launched There's Still Hope in early 2017.
That's awesome. Yeah, really amazing. And how does Beth serve in the ministry?
She does whatever she wants because, as is the case with you guys, she's the brains of the operation. But specifically, she works with women. Since she's gone through the trauma, we've been married 42 years. And so she is very equipped experientially, but also she went back and got a lot of training as through ITAP, ABSAP. She's got a lot of training as a trauma coach. So she works with women one-on-one through a workbook that she's written for spouses that have gone through the trauma of being married to a sex addict. And she does groups for women as well. And we do couples groups together. We do speaking together. We'll do conferences together. So she's very much my partner in this. We're both full-time in this ministry. And she's very passionate about helping women that have gone through the trauma of the discovery of being married to a foreigner sex addict.
Yeah. And does she do much work with women dealing with their own sexual addiction, or is it really wives or women living the fallout of their husband or partner's addiction?
She does not work with women in their own sexual addiction. There are times I wish she did, because that is such a huge need. And she's not comfortable with that because she's not really trained in that.
Sure. They're very different issues.
Yeah, very different. And she's not a recovering sex addict herself. And she doesn't want me to work with women. I don't want me to work with women. So and I hate that, because the latest data I saw said that among adults under 30 that are looking at pornography, 40% of those are women. And it's 2 in 5. So it's a huge need, a growing need. The Porn Phenomenon book that just came out, a follow-up from the work that was done a few years ago, showed that as well. And so, no, I wish we, not only that we had that aspect to our ministry, but even knew where to send people. There's not a lot of places that deal with that.
Yeah, and a couple things occur to me as you say that first of all, obviously, I'm sure Beth's plate is full and overflowing with women who are trying to recover and trying to deal with the trauma of what they've experienced through their husband's sexual addiction, and so I mean that unfortunately that's just a continuing area of growth, unfortunately. But in addition to that, I mean, I think of ministries like, or organizations, not ministries, but organizations like She Recovery. Our friend Crystal Renaud Day is involved in leading that organization, and it's so important. It's such an essential program. That's primarily, as the name would indicate, for women dealing with and wanting to overcome sexual brokenness, sexual addiction. So there are some, but I mean, honestly, like, I'm not sure of other groups outside that are specific to that issue, besides Crystals. I know that Pure Desire Ministries out of Portland, Oregon, they were predominantly, I think originally, mostly oriented toward helping men in their sexual addiction, but they certainly have expanded that to women as well. So they certainly have an area of their organization that's dedicated to that too. But anyway, we could talk a lot about those particular issues. Oh, and also to those watching or listening to this, Mark is getting over a cold. So we'll just note that right now, just in case you hear some coughing or whatever, he needs to pop in a cough drop or something. You won't be surprised by that. So, but Mark, I would love for you to kind of, the ministry itself, your ministry, you started about 8 years ago, you mentioned, and that is called There's Still Hope. Great name for that. What would you say, again, rough numbers, you may know exactly, or it may be more rough. What would you say the numbers have been percentage wise of the work you're doing amongst pastors versus Christian guys? Are you predominantly working with Christian men?
Predominantly Christian men, and within that, a subset of that is pastors. And because of my own background being a pastor, so a lot of
Sure.
people feel safe with me
Yeah.
who are pastors. I think the best way to answer that is we do 10 weekly groups that we call freedom groups. We work through a workbook that I've written that's got 52 chapters to it. So each week they're focused on a different topic.
Yep.
And within those 10 groups, two of those are just for pastors. So that'd be 20%.
Yeah.
And from an attendance and membership standpoint of the groups, I would say that's about right. Maybe it's a little
Okay.
more than that. So close to a quarter of the guys that are in my groups. Now, I also do one-on-one work with guys, and in that, it's probably 50% pastors. Because what happens is the churches that have become aware of us will send men on staff to us because they're trying to save their position or their marriage. Their church is really struggling through this. Whereas a guy that's, no offense to plumbers, but a guy that's a plumber, his boss is less likely to say, wow, if we're going to keep you, you're going to have to get through this.
Right.
Whereas a lot of churches and denominations will send people to us. So it's a good chunk. We've worked with 60 or 70 pastors, I would say, over the course of the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is a huge number. And of course, as I've often said, that the higher you go in leadership within Christianity, the harder it is to get real with anybody about the issues that you're struggling with, particularly of a sexual nature. So there's already a lot of motivation because of fear of losing their job, because of fear of losing the image that they've had, which would certainly be true, as well as potentially their families, whatever. The shame that would come with that. It's just the higher you go in leadership, the more intensified that is. I don't have to tell you. I mean, you live that in spades, but the more intensified that is, and so the greater motivation to keep it under wraps, to try to deal with it yourself, which of course is always unsuccessful. And there is something that is a truism that God requires us to bring these things out into the light to really find the genuine healing that we need. Could you speak to those issues a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the model for recovery, and I've searched the scripture trying to find what would be a really good example of what it takes. And for me, it's John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, we read the story of the paralytic who'd been sick for 38 years.
Mm.
And as I read the scripture, I see four things. You just touched on this that he had to go through in order to come out on the other side. And for every person who's struggling with addiction, the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's this or some other addiction. It could be substance, it could be
Yep.
behavioral, doesn't matter. Those four things that I read in the scripture, the first one is desperation. Jesus said to the man in John 5:6, do you really want to be well? I've written a book called Recovery Rules that we'll probably talk about in a moment. My first rule of recovery is that if you're 90% in, you're 100% out. And that's where I was for much of my life. I was 90% in, but that put me 100% out because I was so
Right.
desperate. And this is the hardest thing I've ever had to overcome. Later this month, I'll celebrate 10 years of total sobriety, which to me is an absolute miracle because for 30 years, I never had a month where I wasn't acting out. I spent over $70,000 on this disease over 30 years. And so I had to be desperate, and we have to be desperate. The paralytic was desperate. The second thing is we have to be surrendered to our higher power. And of course, for you and me, we know that's Christ. Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk, which really didn't make sense. What would have made sense would have been once you can walk, pick up your mat. But Jesus said, I want to see you respond in obedience before the healing. I've got to surrender to him every single day. And that's what I love about this disease, this addiction, is that I call it my great unwanted gift because this is what keeps me in that survival mode of surrender every day. The other two things are there has to be disclosure. Someone has to know our stuff. Jesus did not heal this man in privacy. He could have gone by his house that morning on the way to the pool of Bethesda and healed him there. But he waited until he was there in front of all these other people.
Yeah.
And then finally, there must be community. That same day, Jesus found the man at church. There was something intuitive within him that said, I've got to maintain connection if I'm going to maintain sobriety. And so for me, I go to 2 recovery meetings every week, one on Thursday night, one on Wednesday morning, just for my own recovery. One is a 12-step group. But it all starts, and I think this is what you were indicating a moment ago, with that absolute desperation. I've got to want this really bad. And for most of my life, I was more comfortable with the problem that I knew than the solution that I didn't know.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of pastors, Christian men and women in general, I mean, others that aren't believers too, but certainly within Christendom, I think that's where so many people find themselves, is being more comfortable with what they're familiar with, even though they kind of hate it. But of course, the thing that they hate and the thing they'd like to overcome has also been meeting a need, and so now it's a matter of, I remember a common thing I would hear, or a common refrain, when I was overseeing the counseling ministry at the church that I worked at. I would hear quite often when people would realize, oh, that's the thing that's the root issue. It's not the symptom that I came in looking for help on. It's we're getting down to the root issues. But if I give that up, who will I be? Like if I give that up, like, this is so core to my identity, so core to how people know me, so core to who I think I am. If I give this up, then who will I be? And then just what you said from John 5, we don't have answers to who we're going to be. Really, what Jesus is saying is, will you step in out by faith enough and surrender enough to step into the unknown with me, where you don't know who you're going to be? But I mean, doing that, getting to the other side of that, or entering into that process is, I mean, it's everything in terms of stepping into freedom, stepping into new life, breaking those chains, and walking out of those. And I also agree with you. It's not just a once and done. There are some people, I could count them on one hand, who have had a miraculous experience with God. And people probably get sick of hearing me say this, but I often joke that the rest of us hate those couple of people, because it's what we all, we wanted that instant fix, in a sense. And yet what God calls us on, I think now, is a much more rich and I love this path of discipleship. I'm different. I'm radically different today because of the journey that Jesus took me on, that I never wanted to go on. I just wanted to show up with your wand and poof, fix it. I'm so much different today, and I think for the good, than I would have been if he had just taken it away to start with.
Totally
Right?
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to pray that, and I'm sure you did so many times. Now, I refer to addiction as my best friend that I ever had because, or I'm sorry, not my best friend, my most reliable friend, not my
Mm,
best, but reliable friend who's always there when I needed it. But to your point about this journey, the real win for me is not the destination of being able to say I am sober, whatever that looks like exactly. I am in recovery. That's fantastic. But what the real blessing is in the journey. You know, one of
yep.
my recovery rules says that it's all about direction, not destination. And so by being in this journey, I've met so much more authenticity with guys than I ever knew before. I mean, in
Yep.
my groups, we've got guys that are, their issues have included everything from cross dressing to a lot of same sex attraction issues, some that have had attraction to children, and some that have crossed some other lines that are pretty scary, pretty dark. But what we all have in common is that we're on a journey together and we're
Hmm.
able to talk about it with a non judgmental atmosphere. And that's a journey that I would not trade for anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really true. Well, I would love for you, Mark, just to share a little bit. I mean, your latest book is out, and I think it's pretty hot off the press. Can you explain that a little bit for those listening or
Sure.
watching this
You
podcast?
bet. You bet. One of the things that I've tried to do is to focus on filling gaps that maybe have not been filled somewhere else. So
That's
I've
great.
noticed that there's not a lot out there about long term recovery. It's all about getting sober. And so I spent a year just doing a lot of research on this and in all addictions. And I believe it's 156 addictions that are recognized by the American Psychological Association. And the result of that was this book, Advanced Recovery.
Mm,
And it's for guys that have 1 year of sobriety or more who are trying to keep it going and maintain that. And the challenges we face once we've been doing recovery work for a while. It's one thing to get into it, and I work with guys like that all the time. But what about the guy that's already been sober for a while, or he's
yep.
got a good track record, things are going well? He's still in those groups with the new guy that just showed up last week. But what about him? And so one of the things I did with this is I interviewed 40 different guys that had long-term sobriety, totaling over 200 years total. So on average, these 40 guys had 5 years of sobriety, and they were all men that I'd known that had gone through our ministry, and they shared with me the things that helped to keep them sober. And so that's in the book, as well as 12 different keys to staying sober. And out of that, we're launching a group. Would love to invite anyone to participate. It costs nothing. We're going to do an advanced recovery webinar starting on January 21st. That's a Tuesday night
Mm,
through there'sstillhope.org. And all you need is the book, which you can get through us or through Amazon. And each month, we will take 1 hour a month on the Tuesday night and so talk about these 12 different aspects to long term or what I call advanced recovery. So that's what just came off the press, as you said. We're really excited about that.
that's so great. So you'll be taking a year. I mean, there are 12,
Mm-hmm.
12 different chapters
Yep.
once a month. And so, though, again, for those that aren't watching this podcast but are listening to it, it's Advanced Recovery, right, by Mark Denison. And
Advanced recovery. And they can find out
that's
more through
right,
our
Advanced
website,
Recovery.
which is
Yep.
there'sstillhope.org.
Great, great. And the offers out there to get the book and to join them once a month over the course of the next year, going through and unpacking each one of those chapters. That is such an essential point, and I love the fact, Mark, that you're being strategic and really thinking through. Hey, where's there a gap? Because there's a lot of stuff
Mm-hmm.
out there that's really good, and even when there's multiple resources kind of in a similar vein, oftentimes they're still approached from different perspectives, and so the different resources can be very helpful even though you're kind of talking about the same issue. But how important it is to have somebody writing, speaking, teaching about in an area that doesn't get much foot traffic, and yet there are so many people that are in desperate need of that. I mean, one of the things that I've recognized over the course of having been on pastoral staff, for the 12 years that I was, and now leading this ministry going on 12 years this year, is what I'm becoming more and more aware of is I used to often think, and actually this thought came to me a week or two ago very clearly, and I love the fact that I'm bringing it up with you because I think you very much so will have something to kind of speak into this. But this thought kind of came to me that I think for many people, we've kind of generically thought of heterosexuals and then LGBTQ, and within the LGBT, we kind of break that down by the letter and describe kind of what that person is, or so we kind of label people, and of course, even within the context of the label, there's first of all, no one is just the accumulation of a label, but we're so much more complex than that. There's so much more to us than that, obviously, but what this kind of broad swath of the heterosexual population, you kind of think of them as just being same or opposite sex attracted. They're the ones that are healthy. Maybe a few of them are dealing with some kind of a pornography issue or whatever. But what I've realized in more recent time, thinking back on the number of years that I've met, counseled, mentored, et cetera, men and sometimes couples, is honestly, I think the proliferation of fetishes within the heterosexual population is almost more normative maybe than it is aberrant. I mean, it in a sense, it is outside of God's design for us. It is, but I'm feeling like no. I think there are so many people within the church, outside the church for sure, but certainly within the church, who are experiencing within their opposite sex attracted desires all kinds of stuff that is not what God really created us for in sexual expression between a husband and a wife. Can you kind of speak to that? Your
Totally agree.
perspectives there?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally agree. I early on in this journey for us, I felt like when someone said that his issue was heterosexual pornography, masturbation, maybe going to massage parlors, and that's all they said. I was like, okay, that's everybody. That's where we are. Now I've come to believe that when a guy says what we would consider to be the generic sexual addiction acting out behaviors, he's probably lying.
Yeah.
He's probably saying what he wants us to think he's supposed to say.
Tip of the
Because the
iceberg.
further I get down the journey with guys, I learned that this thing, it just takes you further than you want to go, and it keeps you longer than you want to stay. It
Yeah.
costs you more than you want to pay. It takes you places you never thought you would go. I saw a study a while back that showed that, and I've seen this several times, that 60% of heterosexual male sex addicts cross the gender line at some point. 60%. So they don't identify as homosexual. They're not homosexual, but there's a curiosity there,
Yeah.
and so 3 out of 5 will cross that line. And I've found that to be true in my experience, not for me personally, but for the guys I work with. But more than half have done that at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I land is I'm just trying to help people find Christ. I'm trying to help them find growth in this journey. We don't get into the various fetishes or attraction issues or same sex or any of that. If they want to find freedom from the bondage of addiction, we want to help them do that. Because if not for the grace of God, I could have gone a million other directions
Yep.
myself.
Right.
I mean, I hear stories. I think, well, that's weird. And I actually told a guy that one time. He said, you know what I think is weird is a guy's a senior pastor who's hooking up with women twice a week. I think that's a little weird.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, I guess it is. But that was my story, so it seemed
Right.
normal to me at the time. But yeah, I think that if the truth is really known, that this addiction expresses itself in about as many ways as there are people.
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's so important that our listeners, our audience understand that for two reasons. I mean, probably plenty, but one big reason would be that there are undoubtedly people who are tuning into this podcast who themselves are wrestling with some areas that feel really shameful, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we tend to feel generally more shameful about sexual brokenness than any other area of life, I think.
Absolutely.
But then when there's a variation on that, when guys who really are not same sex attracted or have a real pull or tendency toward that, cross those barriers out of curiosity. Well, oh my gosh, that now compounds the shame so many times over from what they were doing prior, or some other area of dabbling, whether it's BDSM, or the sadomasochistic kind of stuff, or curiosity around a variety of different areas. And I think we just have to be really cognizant and aware that if you've gone there, if you have stepped into an arena that even feels outside of quote unquote normal sexuality. Of course, it's all outside of it, right? From God's perspective, God designed sexuality, our sex, to be sexual expression to be done within the context of marriage, in that safe covenant relationship. Anything outside of that is outside of his design, period. But then we start getting into some of these other areas of expression and exploration and heightened arousal, that kind of stuff, that only tends to trap us even more and dump more shame on us. So people need to know, again, love the name of your ministry. This applies here. There's still hope. It doesn't matter where you've gone, what's been done to you, what you yourself have wrestled with. There's still hope, and it's that's a primary reason why Mark and Beth's ministry exists, and so important to reach out to them. The other thing I just want to say is, for those listening, and you might be thinking, "Oh, Garry, what are you talking about? I don't feel any of that stuff." Well, this podcast really is for you as well, because you need to understand that the people around you, the people it isn't just some creepy looking person who's off in some back alley somewhere, or I mean, just such a stupid imagery, but it isn't just this bizarre person. It's the clean cut guy. It's the sweet gal that's sitting next to you in church on Sunday. Any number of these people can be dealing with this stuff because it's gotten a hold of them. And oftentimes it's gotten a hold in early childhood. It's gotten a hold in the early developmental years of our lives. And Mark, you talked about, I just wrote down a couple of things. I also had a speech impediment issue when I was a kid, and got a lot of tons of teasing and being picked on as a result of that. And then just those the early junk that happened that kind of sets us apart from everybody else in some ways. You had that compounded because of major health issues and sight issues and all of that. But man, when you're describing that well, when you shared your testimony, that so much of what was happening with you as a pastor, its roots went all the way back there. And so how do you help for the person who's listening that doesn't experience some of this stuff themselves? How do you help them bridge the gap to have compassion? That doesn't mean affirm sin or not. That we can be repulsed by sin, but still understand that the person acting that out is an image bearer of God. He loves them and he wants to redeem them. So what are your thoughts around some of that to help our listeners connect those dots some?
Well, first, we're all messed up, and my shame is tied to what culture tells me is abhorrent. Therefore, I feel shame based on that. But we're all messed up.
Yep.
And I try to help people understand that whether it manifests in this way or in something else, it can be a million different things. There are three things at the root of addiction from my perspective in my study. One is abuse, another is isolation, and the other is trauma. None of us chose any of those. And so from the compassion standpoint, when I understand that I've never known anyone that asked for this. I've never known anyone who said, I think I'd like to be a sex addict.
Right.
And for those who feel like they haven't gone through trauma or abuse or isolation, I would remind them that if you've looked at pornography under the age of 16 or so, that becomes your trauma because the brain is just not equipped to process what it's taking in. And so you have trauma from that. I had trauma, as I said earlier, that was rooted in things my granddad did.
Yes.
And I didn't even know about that until about 10 years ago. And yet I still had the results of it still affected me. So when we begin to understand the plight of the human race and that all of us have messed up and that we have got trauma in our background, even if we don't know it, if that doesn't bring about compassion, I'm not sure what does. Jesus looked at the woman that was caught in adultery and said, "He that's without sin cast the first stone." because we're all messed up in some way.
Yeah.
And that for me keeps driving me back to compassion, back to the cross.
Well, and what seems paradoxical about what you're talking about, what I was asking about, is as you were sharing, I'm just reminded that Jesus really blasted the Pharisees in saying that the prostitutes and the sinners are going to get into the kingdom of heaven before you, and so the two things that he often went after the Pharisees about was their legalism, but also their hypocrisy, the way that they manage their image on the outside. And what I find is that our churches, I would say our churches are, that's the dominant position of most Christians, is we are constantly window dressing, constantly manicuring our image, while what Jesus said to the Pharisees is you're whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. You're a cup that is clean on the outside and full of junk on the inside. And so I think sadly that truism, that isn't just true of the Pharisees, that's true of us as religious people, oftentimes, who are operating out of that place of both legalism often as well as hypocrisy, and shining a light, turning a mirror on everybody else, but keeping the light off of me because I'm so broken actually, but I can't let anybody see it, or I don't think that I can. And so the irony is that the capacity for the sinner who knows how broken they are, the capacity for them to repent is actually greater than for the self-righteous who don't think they need any real repentance. And so that's part of the great irony, I think, in the kingdom of God, is God doesn't wink at our sins. He calls us to repentance. But for those who know that they're broken and they're a mess, it's easier for them to actually step over that line, cross that threshold into genuine repentance sometimes, many times, than it is for the person who considers themselves to be in so much better condition.
Yeah, I had a missionary from Africa tell me recently, I thought this was really interesting, that in their language where he was, their native language, I forget what country, but it was in the central to southern part of Africa, they did not have a word for lie, Lie, does not exist in their language. But they do have a word for lies, Lies. And the reason is that they are convinced that there is no such thing as a single lie. And I found that fascinating. I thought that's true of sin, of all sin, and so when we say, okay, that's the one sin. Now there's a lot of sin. I've seen a lot of studies that show that the people that are in churches that are more legalistic, and I won't name names, but
yeah,
the more legalistic types, they tend to struggle the most with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
There's a religion in the United States that is not very large population-wise, but has at least 3 ministries I'm aware of just for sex acts, just within that religion or denomination. You have to be a part of their faith to be in this because it's such a mammoth problem, and they're very, very, very legalistic. And so people are going through life thinking I'm either perfect or I'm terrible. And either way, I'm susceptible to addiction and temptation.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you what kind of work do you do with couples? I mean, you mentioned there's obviously individuals you work with men, both pastors and I think anyone that's really desiring change and has what the key ingredient you mentioned, which is desperation, which I totally agree with you. That is essential, because it's the desperation that keeps it adds that last 10% component of being 90% in, you're 100% out, but that desperation kind of bridges that gap, and we're 100% in and committed. But what do you guys do? How do you work with couples a little bit more specifically?
Well, about 3-4 years ago, we wrote a book. I'm old school. When in doubt, write a book. So we like to do that.
That's good.
And it's a couple's guide to recovery. And it's so funny. We were very aggressive, I guess is a good word for it. So it's 52 topics. And there's 52 couples exercises within the book. And so the way it works is, and the way we set it up, we were doing local groups here in Florida, as well as by Zoom. And we would take 6 to 8 couples at a time. And for 1 year, we'd all be together and go through these 52 topics. They would do the homework. The next week, after they've done their couples exercises, we come back and talk about it and move to the next topic. After doing that for a year, we discovered that most people don't want to look at each other that long. And so we've changed it. And instead of a year, we go 12 weeks now. So we've taken our 12 favorite chapters in the book so we can do more couples groups that way and focus on the topics that we think are probably most appropriate and most helpful. So yeah, if anyone's interested, reach out to us. We're going to start our next couples groups in about 5 or 6 weeks by Zoom. I don't remember the cost, but it's not very much.
Yeah.
And we use our workbook and we team teach, so it's always the couple there with us. The only requirement is they need to have done recovery work. So we've discovered that having a couple come in that has not already done some work individually, while they become very entertaining for the rest of us, it's not very helpful.
Yes.
Because they're just not ready to work together yet. So that's the only requirement, but love to do the groups.
What do you wind up doing, Mark? There's been times when I was on pastoral staff, I'm thinking of in particular, where I referred some men out to a live-in program, for example. Other times that I'd referred some people to a program, not a live-in program, but a program. And there was actually in a couple of cases I can think of, I think most usually it was just kind of out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't, there was communication's always a challenge, no matter, and churches are notorious for lousy communication oftentimes, or needing support in that area. But there were a couple of times that it seemed like there was an intentional kind of stone wall, like we have the answers, and the guys are really, learning from us, and they didn't do anything to kind of bridge the gap between the community that they were going back to, that they'd come from, where they have family, they have responsibilities, they're coming back to this church or whatever. They didn't do anything to bridge the gap and help tie us to what they were already doing and give and help it be more cohesive. They just kind of were done with the program and sort of went back and kind of came back, but there was really no cohesiveness to it. What do you and Beth do to try to mitigate that or help in that area?
We want to be lifelong partners with people in recovery. And I write a daily devotion that goes out called Recovery Minutes. Respond to anybody who ever responds to that. And anyone who's ever gone through our groups has access to us anytime, our cell numbers, emails, all of that. But the primary thing we try to do is make sure we get them in community. And I so identify with what you just said. As I'm sure you've done, I've referred people to so many in-house treatment centers where they're paying $1,000 a day to go someplace for a month or 2 months. And I looked at the material; they do great stuff, but it's in an artificial setting, and I mean by design. And so once that person goes through that, the downfall is if you now put them back in the world they came from without any tools on how to appropriate this in the real world, they go right back where they were.
Right.
I've got so many guys I've worked with that came to me because they'd gone through one of these programs and then got out, and within just days they would relapse. So our experience has been that people that come out of these centers only make it if they are in a community once they get out. So either the center has to have an alumni group that's meeting, which some of them do, but that tends to be by Zoom, or if they could find an in-person group, so much better. So all the material in the world, for me, recovery is more about connection than knowledge. And so learning stuff, and writing down a billion notes, reading books. I mean, I love books. I write books. We're all fans of that. But if I'm not connected with people, it's not going to work.
Yes.
There's something that I've developed. It's one of my recovery rules that I call the man code. You mind if I talk about that for a second?
No, please do. And talk about recovery. Yeah.
Okay.
Recovery rules right there.
Yeah, we have 100 rules of recovery, and if anyone's interested, I send them out every day by text. I've got about 500 guys right now that receive a text message every morning at 10 o'clock Eastern. It's free, doesn't cost anything. Just reach out to me, love to add you to that list. And we just go through these 100 rules and repeat it every 100 days. Well, one of the rules, we talk about the man code, and it's about connection. And Jesus mirrors this for us. There are certain numbers that every man needs to have in his life. For Jesus, those numbers were 1, 3, 12, 120, and 5,000. If he had them, I need them. The 1 represents God. He spent a lot of time with the Father. The number 3, Peter, James, and John, an inner circle that knows everything. He was
Yep.
closer to them than he was anyone else. When he went to the Mount of Transfiguration, he took Peter, James, and John. When he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, only Peter, James, and John were there. Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John. He had 3 guys. I need 3 guys or so in my life that know my stuff. The number 12 is the small group, the disciples. I need to be in a small group. The 120 represents the church, Acts chapter 1. The 5,000 represents the community, feeding of the 5,000. And so one of my rules in recovery is I need balance. If all I do is focus on my vertical relationship with God, the 1, I'm out of balance. I need the 1, I need the 3, I need the 12, I need the 120, I need the 5,000. Couple other rules, and then we can talk about some of these.
Well, can I just jump in on
please,
that particular
please
rule? I
do.
want you to go on to the next one. But something
Yeah.
else that I think is so critical is many times we tend to kind of look at these different segments, the 1, the 3, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of make them into the piece of the pie or a piece of the pie. Whereas if we're in right relationship with the 1, with God, there's a direct link that we get in terms of benefit from that direct connection with him, obviously, but there's also a way that we benefit from connection with him through the 3 and through the 12 and through the others, that when those pieces are missing, not only are we missing relationship with those ones, we're missing relationship with the 1 who lives in them. And so there's things I believe that God does in our lives, pouring through the conduit of those different avenues, that it's not just about, oh, I've got my time with God over here and I've got my time with the 3 or the 12 or the whatever, but it's actually, no, God is in that too. And we're missing both the people and him when we isolate ourselves from any one of those categories.
Yeah, if I'm not right with you, I'm not right with God.
Right.
It's hand in glove, absolutely. Another one of the rules I have in the book, and I love for guys to get this off our website, the book Recovery Rules, is, and this is something I really struggled with for a long time early in recovery, is that relapse is not an event, it is a process. Someone will come to one of my groups and say, I relapsed last night, or they'll text me and say, I had a relapse Tuesday. I know what they mean. I
Yep.
looked at porn, I masturbated, I hooked up with someone, I texted, did something across the line. The 3 circles exercise that we get from AA, I got into that inner circle. Totally get that. I have a sobriety date. I know what that means. That's great. But really, relapse is not an event, it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a relapse tomorrow, it's because of what I was doing today. Because what I think today is what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Yep.
There's a process of relapse and the way I like to say it is there's 6 points to it. I think it, then I plan it, then I do it, and then I hate it, and then I cover it, and then I go do it again. It's this constant cycle. I think it, I plan it, I do it, I hate it, I cover it, I do it again. It all starts in the head. And so one of my recovery rules says you got to focus on the process. Am I spending time with God? Am I truly doing an inventory of myself? Am I treating my children right? Am I connecting with others? Am I connecting with my spouse if I'm married? Am I living a life of honest and trustworthiness? What's my fantasy life like? What's going on up here? Because my biggest sex organ is my brain.
Yep.
I've got to balance all of that because relapse is not an event as much as it's a process.
And while we're talking about it, the rules, recovery rules, sorry, what, I think there were a couple of, I mean, there's 100 of them, right? So there's a bunch you could
Yeah.
go through, but you just have a couple of others that might be favorites or ones that you kind of have on the top of your head right now to share with our listeners.
Yeah, one that comes to my head really quick is that recovery leaks, LEAKS. I can't just store up recovery and say, okay, went to a bunch of meetings, went to a retreat somewhere, learned a bunch of stuff, listened to some podcasts,
I'm filled up.
pour all this stuff in, I'm filled up, I'm good now, but it leaks. And so if I don't do something every day, I had a friend tell me years ago, he said, every day read 1 page of recovery material. do something every morning. So I do that every morning. I make a point of doing something because if I don't, I know that it's going to leak.
Mm-hmm.
Another one of my rules is that recovery is found in your daily agenda. It doesn't just happen. I've got to have a plan. I've got to know what I'm going to do. For me, every morning I pray the third step prayer, the seven step prayer, the serenity prayer. I read a devotional every single morning. At night, I spend time in the Word. Right now, I'm using the Recovery Bible, and I love that. I like to mix things up some, but it's all about the daily agenda. And let me give you one other one. It's a rule that I've used for guys that has really helped them a lot in terms of staying sober, and that is to always remember the end game. And the
Yep.
way that works is that I will tell a guy when he's tempted to do something stupid, he's tempted to act out, do something he knows he shouldn't do, is don't just tell yourself, okay, don't do that, but rather back up and say, okay, what if I do it? Play it forward in your mind. What will it be like to have that engagement, to have that experience? But don't stop there. Play it forward, which means you'll have the encounter, you'll have that rush that lasts for about a millisecond.
Yep.
And then after that comes the guilt. After that comes the shame. After that comes the disclosure. After that comes the disconnect spiritually. And you don't want that. So
Which lasts
remember
for a
the
long
end game,
time. Yeah.
which can last forever. And it's never worth it.
Mm-hmm.
One other one, real quick, if I could, is
Sure.
the 20-minute rule. 20-minute rule is basically science tells us that with the dopamine rush and the neurotransmitters are all clicking, we've got that fantasy, we've got that hit, that if I can stay sober for 20 minutes, I can make it. Because in about 20 minutes, that dopamine rush begins to come back down, which is why for a lot of guys that are going to go hook up with a woman somewhere, they will say to me, and this was my experience for decades, that the rush really peaked before they even got there
Yeah.
because it's in that 20 minutes. It's the planning stage, it's the excitement of that.
The
But
hunt of it.
then within about 20 minutes, it abates. And so one of the things I do in my book is I give them 10 things to do during those 20 minutes, such as get up and go for a walk or make a call, or read a scripture, pray a prayer, listen to a podcast, do something for
Yep.
20 minutes. Because if you can make it for 20 minutes, you can make it.
Yep. It's so good. Yeah, I love this book, Recovery Rules, what you're just talking about, because each one of the recovery rules are there's a page or two, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's in some cases
Very
three.
short.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just a simple way of kind of unpacking it. I This is a great tool for men, for women to get to just have to go through a rule a day, and you got 100 of them, so you're going to repeat it several times a year.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of just going through a rule or so a day, and also the thing I was when I cracked this open, I was looking at it. You have tons of endorsement. It is, I mean, this is amazing. You've got like 5 pages of short paragraphs of many leaders that people would recognize endorsing what you've written here in this book. And I think some of it's because of the beauty of the simplicity of it. It's not overly complicated, but it really, I think, clears the mind and helps us focus on what is it we're really after, not just the momentary rush. I think it also would help in terms of reorienting us in dealing with the withdrawal symptoms we're experiencing
Mm-hmm.
because of the way that we're not acting out sexually any longer, and addictively, and those kinds of things. So anyway, there's lots of endorsement and lots of reasons to get for people to get their hands on this book. I think it's a huge resource.
I appreciate that, Gary. Thank you. I
Yeah.
enjoy
So
doing it.
what's that?
I enjoy doing it. I'm a simple man. I love simple, bite-sized things.
Yep. Yep. I think that's so helpful. And when before we wrap up here, we're kind of getting to the end of our podcast, but I always love to ask people when I think of it, what if there's anything, there may be a subject or two, a topic or two we haven't talked through, connected for our audience. And I would love if there's something that's on your heart or mind you haven't really been prompted to say or hasn't come up in our conversation. What's on your heart that you might want to share with our audience before we kind of wrap things up, if anything?
Practice good self-care. I recommend that guys have a recovery day once a month. We live in so much shame, and I know for me, I had to give up all my hobbies because they were all intertwined in my addiction. That included sports memorabilia, coin collecting, musical instruments, a lot of things I was really into.
Mm.
And it took me a long time to realize God didn't stop loving me when I started acting out, nor did He start loving me once I stopped. He cares about me. He wants me to be happy. He wants me to enjoy life. And I'm to love others as I love myself, not before I love myself. And there's so much shame tied up in this. And so if there's anything I would say to guys that just is right now, it's where I'm at. It's to practice self care, love yourself, do things that you enjoy, find a hobby. Don't define yourself by this. This does not define you. Is not who you are. We are all fallen. We know that. Be good to yourself, love yourself, do a recovery day, get a hobby, do some things you enjoy.
Yep.
For example, I'm from Houston, Texas, where it's always hot. And so
Yes,
I've
I lived there
always
twice. It certainly
been,
is.
no, it's unbelievable. So I moved to Florida so I could enjoy some cold air. I mean, it's that bad. And so I've always loved cold weather and snow. And I get away on a riding retreat every year. So where do I go? I go to Grand Marais, Minnesota. I'll be there in 2 weeks. It's on the northern tip of Minnesota on Lake Superior
Wow.
in the dead of winter when the temperature may drop as low as 40 below if I'm
Woo.
lucky. And snow every place. And I just have a ball doing that. Now that's weird, but that's what I love.
Mm-hmm.
And that is my recovery peak of the year because I'm just practicing good self care. Be good to yourself, do things that you enjoy
Yep.
because I'm not going to do well in recovery because I think poorly of myself. The better I take care of myself, the better I'm going to do in every area
Yep.
of life.
Yep. And I think it in many ways it should go without saying, but I want you to respond to this and even push back on whatever level you might think would be necessary. But obviously we live in it's weird. We live in a time, and we for a long time, maybe from the beginning of time, we tend to be uh many times we beat up on ourselves, and we think that by punishing ourselves that's somehow going to help us break free of some particular behavior or whatever, and we can get into this cycle all the time of doing that. Self-hatred seeps in, and it's a mess. And I think a lot of what you're speaking to is to live counter from that, live differently from that, break free of those kinds of things. But on the other hand, we also live in a society where the pendulum, it doesn't take long at all before the pendulum swings to the other side. And obviously what you're not talking about is a narcissistic kind of love, where there's plenty of people involved in addiction who have a very selfish, narcissistic view of themselves and the world and everything around them. And I just think, so many times when I've spoken to people who are they've grown up in the church, they've been in the church for a long time, they've ministered, they poured out, they've been leaders, whatever, and now they're just pursuing the thing, right? Like they've been wrestling with it for a long time. Wrongly, they've been doing it in secret and acting like they've been doing it right all this time. God's not shown up, and so therefore I'm just going to go off and do my own thing. And when I was in that position, I was unbelievably self-focused. I was absolutely full of myself, full of self-pity. I didn't care anything about, I mean, I didn't want to hurt other people, but by and large, both in terms of the things I chose to do and also the attitude of my heart is, now I was putting myself absolutely in the driver's seat, and I, as long as I was pleased, as long as I was comfortable, that's all that mattered to me. So clearly, I just want to be clear for people, listening, watching, we're not talking about a cultural kind of self-love. We're talking about a biblical a biblical care for ourselves, that where we do need to nurture ourselves, and a part of that nurture helps us break free of these patterns that, frankly, addiction is not because we love ourselves too much. It quite to the contrary. But I just want to simply say that I think what you spoke is so powerful, and I don't want to diminish that in any way. But I think we just have to have, when love is used for everything from pizza to sex and everything in between, I think we just have to be clear about what we mean by loving period, and then loving oneself in particular.
The way I'd respond to that is a couple things. One, to reiterate, no one ever shamed themselves into a better place. But on the other hand, if my recovery is about me, I've missed God. The 12 steps, when they were first written in 1939, were intended to be completed in 30 days. The reason for that is that step 12 says you need to help others. If I'm not giving away my recovery, I don't have recovery. That's the definition of recovery, is helping others. So I'm loving myself, being kind to myself so I can be a better person for Garry Ingraham.
That's right.
So I can bring something to the table for my wife, my son, my grandson, my daughter-in-law, the world I live in. If it all stops here, man, you said it so well. I've missed it. It's not it. It's just not it.
It comes right back to the heart of what God said to Abraham, that you are being blessed to be a blessing.
Right.
Right.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. If it stops with me, then it didn't go very far.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Any other parting thoughts at all, Mark?
No.
Okay.
No, just thank you for this opportunity. I thank you so much for your friendship, and I mean that. And that first day when we met, which you met so many people and you spoke that day, was so powerful. And I just want to encourage you to keep pouring into other guys that are coming along, because if I didn't have encouragement from someone like you 8 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And so may God continue to use you in a profound way, as he has done for so many years.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, Mark. And also thank Beth for us. And it's just amazing you guys are doing such incredible work and putting out such important material, many, many, many books. Get out on their website, everybody, at there'sstillhope.org. Is it? Org?
Yes.
Yep. There'sstillhope.org. And is there another way for people to reach you? Is there any social media for them to follow you on, or is that just the best hub?
That's probably the best thing. I'm going to go and get my cell number. Happy
Sure.
for anyone to call or text me. My number is 941-526-4700. 941-526-4700. I promise I'll respond. If anyone needs someone just to talk to and tell your story and look for some direction, we are honored to do that. Anything we can do to help.
That's awesome. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining me and Mark for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. So glad that you're here, and I look forward to seeing you in a future episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Take care. Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or view future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast. You may also subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Google Music. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a future episode.